Everyone. Welcome to the National Grange webinar, Innovation from Farm to Table. For the next hour, we want to look at the topic of innovation and how new practices, processes, and technical advances can add to a secure food supply for the planet. Food security means more than just people having enough to eat. It involves many other issues. Farming must be economically rewarding because farmers must earn enough to stay in business to produce our food. Government overregulation of normal agricultural practices hinders production and takes time away from productive labor to file paperwork. Very important are advances in scientific research to improve efficiency, conservation of natural resources, and improvements in crop varieties to improve nutrition and health. Food security includes reducing food waste and improving the food distribution system to avoid bottlenecks like we experienced last spring. It also involves preparing for climate change, water and soil conservation, and animal welfare. I'm sure there are many more facets of the topic that will be uncovered in our discussions today. So let's begin with our first panelist, Kevin Igley. Kevin is the Senior Vice President, Sustainability, and Chief Environmental Officer of Tyson Foods. Kevin provides corporate leadership, direction, and technical standards for processes to guide the nearly 600 environmental professionals working at Tyson. He assesses, prioritizes, and manages all aspects of the company's environmental efforts, monitors the status of environmental compliance, and activities for both domestic and international operations. So Kevin, why don't you give us an introductory statement?
Well, good morning. First of all, I want to thank you, Betsy, for moderating this, and this should be an exciting discussion that we have today. And Tyson Foods, we have a lot going on in our company and a lot going on around the world. COVID-19 has presented a lot of challenges. We've been able to face those challenges. And so today we're looking forward to a dialogue where we engage on the whole topic of the entire food system. And we're very, very happy to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. Our second panelist is Colin Woodall, the Chief Executive Officer of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association.
Good morning, everybody. It's a great opportunity to be with you. I'm excited to talk about what we are doing in the cattle industry in terms of food security, sustainability, and the need for continual improvement. And I think that's one of the themes that we will talk about throughout the hour, is how all segments of the food supply chain is working very hard to continue to improve our overall environmental impact, to make sure that we're utilizing technologies and working towards more efficient ways to feed the ever-growing number of mouths, not only here at home, but abroad. From the perspective of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, we approach this from many different angles. We work on the policy side of this to make sure that we don't have those overburdensome regulations that Betsy had talked about. We need to make sure that we are setting up a regulatory framework that allows for innovation, that allows for the freedom to operate. I think that's key in making sure that the cattle industry remains effective and efficient. But also, as one of the contractors to the National Beef Checkoff, we spend a lot of time on research and also on promotion and education among the consumer, because we know that with less than 2% of the nation's population involved in agriculture, there are a lot of people who just don't have that connection to what we do to put food on the table, and we need to continue to educate them. I believe the COVID crisis has given us a great opportunity to reignite that dialogue, and so that is something that we are taking advantage of. So again, I'm excited to be a part of today's conversation, and thanks for having me, Betsy.
Thank you, Colin. Next, we have Gary Sloan, the Chief Domestic Operations Officer for Feed the Children. Gary's been working with Feed the Children since 2008. Prior to his present position, he was the Vice President of Logistics and Inventory Management for the organization. Gary?
Yeah, thank you, Betsy. I too am very excited to be part of this discussion today. You know, being part of the nonprofit world, one of the keys is around collaboration, whether it's us working with the corporate world, the government, individual donors, that type of thing, and other nonprofits. The key really is collaboration. And that's something we take very seriously at Feed the Children. And we do have a network of over 1,000 community partners across the United States. And that's really key to helping us work towards defeating hunger. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this forum today and look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Gary. And fourth, I believe he just joined us, Todd Van Hoose, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Farm Credit Council. As the President and CEO of Farm Credit Council, Todd leads the efforts to represent the interests of the farm credit system before Congress. He's served in this position for the last 4 years. So Todd, will you give us some introductory comments, please?
I should probably unmute myself first. Thanks, Betsy. I appreciate joining you, and I apologize to everybody that I was a little bit tardy arriving this morning. I was just on the phone with one of the Farm Credit Board of Directors out in Southern Colorado who were talking a lot about exactly what you all are talking about, and that is, you know, how do we look forward in agriculture to the challenges that I think we're going to be facing? And we had long conversations yesterday. On Capitol Hill, we brought in a couple of farm credit system CEOs to brief people on credit conditions, and they raised a lot of really good issues. And one of the ones that I think they raised that's relevant for this discussion is the pandemic has kind of, you know, it's done a lot of terrible things and had a huge impact in a lot of ways, and will have lasting impact. But one of the good things that's happened is that it's focused people on their food supply. And it's focused people on the need, on what it takes to grow it here and get it there. And what happens when there's an interruption in that. One of our CEOs yesterday was talking about, I don't think people realize how close we came to disaster. As the livestock industry saw back up to the farm, plants shut down, grocery store shelves started to see some impact on that, prices started to rise to the consumer. I think people understood that part, but if the part I don't think they understood was, as bad as that was, if it had gone on for even a few more weeks, it would have been magnitudes worse. You would have had an environmental disaster. You would have had a hunger disaster. And I think this creates a moment for all of us to talk in agriculture about, look, we need to re-up on how important this industry is in the country and what it means to have a sustainable agricultural industry, what it means to have innovations that it's going to take to feed a growing population, not only in this country, but around the world. And I think that's the challenge before us. But as I say, that one of the few benefits of the pandemic is I think it's given us a platform to really start to talk about that. So I congratulate you on having this panel today, because I think it's part of that discussion, and appreciate you inviting me.
Thank you. So for our first question, directed to all four panelists, and I think we'll call on you in the order that I introduced you. So the COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated to the American public just how important the food supply chain is to us, as Todd just said, to us, our families, and our neighbors. What have we learned to date, or what more can we do to assure that we have enough food for everyone and we're able to get food from the farm to the consumer's table? And how does innovation enter this equation? So, Kevin.
Sorry, my internet blinked.
Oh, no.
No, I'm good now. Thank you for the question. Let me start by saying we're still in the thick of the pandemic. We need to realize that. It's going to be difficult. It's not going to get easy right now. So we've been looking at a lot of different things. I will say that communication needs to increase between all of us. The more we can each understand what we're doing, we'll be able to connect the dots and keep the supply chain flowing. Let me also comment that it's really difficult, and we have been doing a lot of discussion on future, not just right now, but what do we need to be ready for next. But it's been very difficult to evaluate the full impacts on what can be done to mitigate in the future. But as we continue through the uncertainty that we're all facing right now, all of the corporate partners, nonprofits, government, community partners, donors, volunteers, we really need to share what we've collectively learned to identify what have the risks been, what have some of the impacts been, can we come up with comprehensive solutions, things that help us later. I can tell you that at Tyson, I was in the office yesterday. I go in a couple days a week. When you arrive at any Tyson facility right now, you're going to see a focus on human safety. It is our absolute number one priority. The only work we do at Tyson is safe work. And I can tell you about that from personal experiences. When you show up, you're going to be asked questions about how are you feeling? You're going to be asked questions. Do you have any of these symptoms? You're going to have your temperature tested. It's very important to do these things and to screen so that we can know what's going on. We've implemented a very complex testing protocol in order to know what's going on all the time and to be able to predict into the future to some degree. We've enhanced our safety protocols. We've increased our protective measures at our facilities. We're constantly educating, re-educating, improving our training around COVID-19. The cleaning and sanitizing has gone up magnitudes in new ways simply because we have a new issue to deal with. We've relaxed attendance policies for our team members. We've waived eligibility for waiting periods on short-term disability for those who need it. But again, it's a big team effort, and there's a lot going on. And as you walk through a facility today, it feels very different. There's lines on the floor telling you which way to go. There's spacing markers to keep social distancing in place. It's very different, but it feels good because you know something's being done to keep everyone safe. So let me switch gears a little bit. Some other things we've been doing during the pandemic, we've donated more than 24 million pounds of protein since our COVID response started back in early March. We've also put about 15 million pounds of protein into communities where our team members live and directly to our team members, helping to support the need for having protein and food in a lot of rural and poverty areas. And we've also continued to support USDA summer feeding program, USDA school lunch program, and then other programs like SNAP and WIC that have been around for a long time. But so that's a brief overview. I appreciate the question. And I just hope that we can all continue to work together and to share information and to learn together and to help one another through the ongoing pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you. Colin, do you have comments on that question?
The COVID crisis definitely taught us a lot of lessons just across the board. And they weren't all negative lessons either. I think that we found a lot of positive developments out of that crisis. One in particular is when we saw this, the state of crisis, the state of uncertainty. As Kevin said, we're still going through it, but when it really started back in March and April, I think Americans were just looking for a little comfort. They were looking for a little safety. And we were excited to see that one way that they tried to find that comfort was by buying beef. And even more exciting was the number of photographs that we received from grocery stores across the country. These weren't just rural grocery stores. These were grocery stores in urban areas as well, where you would have the beef case absolutely cleaned out, but there was still Beyond Beef still sitting there. So I think it was a great barometer for us, because as we went into the year, we were really still concerned about the threat that alternative meats, or fake meat that we call it, had to our industry. And I think when we really put it down to a true vote of support, the consumer voted in our favor, and that was great to see. So we were excited about that, and I think that's going to help us factor in to a lot of our strategy moving forward in terms of dealing with a lot of the alternative proteins that are out there. At the same time, I do believe that COVID showed us just how fragile our beef supply chain is. When you look at where we had the choke point in our industry with the packers, and when those packing plants started reducing their capacity, or in some cases shutting down, then that just had a ripple effect back to the producer and to the consumer. On the producer side, we saw fed cattle that were ready to go into these packing plants start to back up. And of course, that was a natural depression on cattle prices, which really kind of took some of that buoyancy that we had looking at those fake meat case and those empty beef cases. It drained a lot of that, when all of a sudden we started seeing bank accounts getting drained. And we are just now starting to get through that backlog of cattle. Same time, we had a lot of uncertainty with our consumer not knowing whether or not they could get beef. And then when you consider that almost half of what we sell is through food service, seeing restaurants shut down was another big hit. But back to another positive comment, it also showed how nimble that we can be. Because instead of allowing a lot of that product that was sitting in restaurant freezers, restaurant coolers, just sit there, we were able to work with the regulators, we were able to work with the distributors to get those repackaged in a way that it could be sold at retail. So that way we made sure that we didn't have any waste of product. You know, Betsy, you had mentioned at the beginning that one of the biggest issues that I think we have to address is food waste. And we wanted to make sure that we were not contributing to food waste. So as we move forward, we're going to take all of this and factor it into strategies on how we can improve ourselves. Kevin nailed it. We need to make sure that we have communication throughout the food supply chain. We as the producers need to know the challenges that the retailers are seeing, that the packers are seeing. But at the same time, we need to make sure that they understand the challenges that we're being hit with. Collectively, that's the only way we're going to be able to move forward. And we're also working with members of Congress to try to provide some new incentives, new programs that could help us expand packing capacity, especially in smaller plants, because we have seen more direct to consumer opportunities pop up throughout the crisis, which is not only a good opportunity to expand some of that smaller packing capacity, but it's also a great opportunity for cattle producers to be able to brand their product and hopefully sell it for a premium. So like I say, there's some very valuable lessons that we have learned, and a lot of those are ones I think we're going to be able to capitalize moving forward.
Yeah. We will be taking questions from the audience in a few minutes. So the way you ask your question is put it in the chat function at the bottom of your screen. We'll be taking those questions in a few minutes. Gary.
Yes, in the nonprofit side, we've seen a lot of change, both positive and some negative, but what it's really done is shown us we do need to make changes, not just around COVID, but changes in the future to better serve those in need. And one of the things that we're dealing with right now, obviously, is there's more need than we've seen in a long time. If you look at where we were prior to COVID, 1 in 7 children in the US faced food insecurity. That number is now 1 in every 4. So the need has obviously gone up tremendously, which has put a strain in the nonprofit world. If you look at one of the issues we're having right now is actually purchasing food. Not just Feed the Children, but many food banks around the country, There's just, for example, canned food is just not readily available to purchase like it's been in the past. So that's been a tremendous challenge. Cost, as mentioned earlier, has gone up as well. So, that has forced some issues there. If you look at it from a nonprofit, a community partner perspective, we work with over 1,000 community partners across the United States. Some of our community partners have totally changed their programming, and to an extent where some of them are no longer in existence during this crisis. They've actually shut their doors, and that's actually put a strain in the nonprofit world as well because of the distribution aspect of it. So, feed the children, but it has also forced changes too, where before you might have a lot of people show up at a particular event and pick up food. We've had to totally change the way we've distributed product. A lot of what we do now is door-to-door deliveries, which has, I think, been very positive. Again, where people would show up to pick up food, there's been a lot of changes tied to COVID as well. So one of the other things we've learned through this is people who are hungry, there are other, if you look at personal care items as an example, Feed the Children provides personal care items as well as educational supplies to help combat hunger. So for an example, a family that is struggling for food, if we can provide a personal care item through a crisis like this, that's for every dollar of personal care items we can provide, that's $1 potentially that family can use for food and to combat hunger. So again, lots of changes in place. We've had great support, as I mentioned earlier, with the corporate world in providing much needed donated food, but there are certainly challenges there, but both positive and negative has come about as a result of the pandemic.
Thank you, Gary.
Thank you.
Todd, what are you seeing from the farm credit world?
Well, I take a little different perspective at it and come at it this way. And what we're seeing out there is just reinforces something I think all of us already knew. And that is for agriculture to be innovative, right? I mean, that's the theme here is how do you innovate from farm to table? For us to truly innovate and deal with the many challenges that we have to improve the infrastructure on which we operate. The gap between broadband availability in rural areas is enormous. How do you educate kids in the modern world without that? How do you keep anybody at home in the modern world without that? The infrastructure, the physical infrastructure that is deteriorated, everything from roads to bridges to locks and dams and port facilities and everything else. It's one thing to unleash the creative juices in rural America, and our theory has always been bet on farmers to do that, right? Because they're the most creative and innovative people in the world. But we've got to overcome physical distance, and we've got to overcome some of the infrastructure challenges that face our innovators out there in agriculture if we're going to allow them to be successful. So internet, physical infrastructure, and financial infrastructure. Right? If you have an idea right now in Silicon Valley to do something really cool on the internet, you got 5 guys with pocketbooks probably knocking on your door. If you're out in your shed and you've just invented the next great thing for agriculture, you're going to have a hard time finding equity investors willing to support that idea. So all of those kinds of things we think are important to building the kind of environment that will allow agriculture to innovate as it moves forward. Because if we're fundamentally convinced, if you can create that kind of environment, agricultural people will produce it.
Thank you, Todd. Next question. What What agricultural policies or practices do you predict will be most transformational in the next 5 to 10 years? Maybe we should start with Todd on this one.
Oh, great. No, look, I got asked this same question in a little different way summer before last, because we had a group of interns in our office from agricultural groups all around DC, and their interns came over and we had a little presentation for them, fed them lunch, of course, and had some discussion. This young woman, I think she was from Nebraska. That young woman raised her hand. She asked a question. She said, I'm 21 years old. I'm just starting out in the industry. What do you think is the biggest issue I'm going to face? And I said, climate change. And I think that took her aback a little bit. It wasn't the farm bill. It wasn't a lot of other things that she might have been thinking about. But I think the implications of climate change, and especially when you start to look at the political consensus that's forming behind climate change, especially amongst young people, that's going to have an enormous impact on agriculture. And it could be positive, it could be negative, it could be some of both. But, as I think about the next farm bill and the farm bill after that, I think the biggest issue in those farm bills is going to be, how do we address climate change? How do farmers get paid for it? Maybe how do new markets get created from it? How do we protect ourselves from people who want to impose things on us that maybe are not economical? I just think that's going to be one of the biggest issues facing our industry moving forward.
Thanks, Todd. Any other panelists have a comment on that?
Yeah, I would like to build off of Todd's comments because I agree with him 100%. I believe the issue moving forward is going to be climate change and sustainability. As we look at a lot of the other issues that we're dealing with, they tend to be offshoots of that discussion. The discussion of fake meat is an offshoot of sustainability. The discussion of nutrition is now an offshoot of sustainability. What we have seen among the producer community is when you start talking about sustainability, you get a lot of eye rolls in the audience, and you get a lot of that, well, here's somebody just trying to tell me what I need to do again on my operation. And unfortunately, I think as you look at the discussion of sustainability for several years now, it's given that impression that here's the government or here is some entity that's coming to tell you how you need to change. We're trying to change that entire narrative here at NCBA. Instead of looking at this as a negative, somebody coming in and trying to dictate to us, this is a great opportunity for us to show just how the cattle industry in particular can be that net carbon sink, and how we have a great story to tell. We are only 2% of greenhouse gas emissions here in the United States. We can produce the same amount of beef today as we did in 1977 with 1/3 fewer cattle. And even though we have just 8% of the overall cattle numbers in the United States, we can produce 18% of the world's beef. So we already have a great track record that we can showcase. But as we all know, that's not going to be enough for today's consumer and for the general political environment, social environment that we're in. So it's about this continual improvement. How do we find ways to advance our technologies even more to build upon those numbers? So we are really focusing on showcasing what we're already doing, showing how we are trying to continually improve ourselves, and then also utilize a lot of the situations that pop up of how we can be helpful. And I think the wildfires that we're dealing with in California, Colorado, throughout the West is a great example. That has really amplified this discussion of climate change. But we can show how allowing cattle to graze those lands helps reduce those fuel loads, so that way we don't have those devastating fires. And if we can do more of that and try to get over a lot of the restrictions that have been put in place by activists and governments, both national and state governments, it could go a long way in trying to mitigate those fire seasons. But that is a really tough hill to climb, just given all of the activism that we have seen on this throughout the years, court decisions. And even though we may have government agencies that want to do the right thing, their hands are tied. So we've got to figure out how we can sell that better to those people who have those houses in the California hills, to the consumer, to be able to say, hey, we have a solution. It's right here in front of us. It is solar powered. It's self-replicating, it is mobile, and it happens to turn itself into really tasty beef at the end of the day. And it can help reduce the wildfires. And that's what we've got to really spend some time driving that point home.
Thank you. Any other comments?
Yes, but I'd like to add some information to this discussion on climate. There is absolutely no question that not only is climate important, but don't forget about water. And from our foods, everything starts with water, and we really have to be focused on water risk and climate change. So some of what we're doing, we've partnered with some NGOs. We've been working with the World Resources Institute, the Environmental Defense Fund, Nature Conservancy, looking at things ranging from climate, water. We've also looked at grazing. And it's a very, very important time for all of us to share as much as we possibly can on these topics. We at Tyson, with respect to sustainability, but if you don't get after it, you're going to be so far behind. And so at Tyson, we elected in 2008, we set some very bold public goals. We decided that we needed a greenhouse gas target. So we partnered with the World Resources Institute. We went through the Space Targets Initiative target setting process. We set a goal of reducing our greenhouse across our value chain 30% by 2030. It was accepted by SBTI in July of 18. We also made a bold commitment to impact on corn with respect to environment.
I think we just lost Kevin. We'll move on to a question for Gary. What do you see as the biggest barriers to providing nutritional and affordable meals to American children?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, right now, the supply side of that is our biggest challenge at this point. We have, as I mentioned earlier, we've had very good corporate response as far as gift and kind donations overall, which has eliminated some of that barrier, but we still have challenges around purchasing food and that type of thing. And going back to the previous discussion, one of the challenges we have from an agricultural perspective is moving the food from the farmer to the recipient. And there are typically a lot of regulations in place that slow that process down. So if we could remove some of those barriers, that would be very helpful for the nonprofit world to be able to get food faster, fresher, faster food to those in need.
Question for Todd. Can you talk about how credit and financial services can be utilized to stabilize and grow family-owned independent farms?
Oh, sure. I mean, it's credit. I think everybody would acknowledge that the access to credit is critical for farmers. It's always been a relatively capital intensive business, and it's hard to do something with nothing. And so absolutely the ability of farm credit and commercial banks and other providers to withstand downturns in the economy and be a stable and consistent supply of credit out there is critical. What Farm Credit has been focused on is not changing the way it works during this pandemic. In other words, if Farm Credit's always been very dependable out there, and all of a sudden many of our folks weren't in their offices, the challenges of social distancing, the challenges of visiting farmers on their farms, all those things started to occur. We were determined not to let that impact farmers. And you can see that instantly changing the processes, instantly changing how people work, but still being able to grow throughout this entire process. In other words, provide more liquidity into farmers' pockets during this downturn has absolutely been delivered. And so that doesn't happen by accident. We've spent about 30 years building financial strength from the 1980s to now, just for this purpose. And it's one of the reasons that, you know, a reasonably conservative financial institution, reasonably stable underwriting processes, great access to the debt markets, we can deliver all of that to agriculture in rural America every day, irrespective of the current credit conditions. And I think that's what you can count on. You know, I told a member of the media yesterday during a briefing, I said, you know, one of the things you can't do is you can't substitute credit for income. And so while credit is really important, you'll never borrow your way to success. And so, you know, more focus needs to be paid on, especially in a time where we're looking at potential for government payments to agriculture to be decreasing in the coming years over where they've been the last few years. You've got to find more ways for farmers to extract that profit out of the market. That means trade, that means innovation in products, that means efficiency, all of those things that people are talking about, because agriculture has got to be in a position to extract profit out of the marketplace in order to survive and innovate and feed the world. And if, you know, our job is to help fuel that, and we will, but I think the most important thing might not be credit, it might be profit.
Thank you. For Colin, can you talk about some of the agricultural and ranching techniques that cattlemen and women are implementing to better secure the food supply and production?
Absolutely. I think we really have to start with all the work that has been done in improving the overall genetics of our herd. The amount of research that has gone into looking at hybrid vigor, being able to crossbreed, to be able to just overall improve our genetics has been tremendous. And I think that has resulted in not only being able to help improve that overall quality of the product, but also to ensure that we have great seed stock in order to continue to grow our industry and be able to meet those needs. I think one of the biggest challenges, though, as we continue to look at how we improve our herd is the acceptance and the adoption of technologies. And we have a society that will be more than happy to pitch an iPhone that's only 2 years old just to get the newest iPhone. But when it comes to the food supply, well, they don't want to talk about technology. And I get that. I think we all kind of understand that when you're putting something in your mouth, you want to know that it's wholesome. When we start talking about technology, people get a little concerned. And it's back to one of my earlier comments that if you don't have that daily exposure to agriculture, that sounds a whole lot worse than it really is. And so we, I think, have a twofold challenge here. One is the education of how technologies can be utilized to protect our food supply, grow our food supply, and try to make, whether it's a crop, an animal, whatever, more efficient in producing that food stuff. But at the same time, ensuring that we have a regulatory framework that allows us to innovate and come up with new technologies. A great example is gene editing technology within livestock, something that probably holds a lot of promise in making those animals more efficient. But right now, that regulation is at the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, and they are considering that as a new drug rather than a production practice. And so because it's being considered as a new drug, that it's going to be harder for us to actually be able to get it to a point where it's commercialized, and it's going to be so burdensome that I don't think it's going to be a technology we're going to be able to capitalize on. So we're working very closely with USDA to see if we can get them to help us engage to ensure that they have a hand in helping one, educate their fellow regulators, to say, hey, look, let's make sure that this is something that ultimately can be used by producers. So that's another challenge for NCBA, not only the educational side with the consumer to get them to understand the role of technology, but to make sure that the regulators don't snuff out a lot of this innovation and initiative to come up with better ways to produce beef.
So Gary, we have one of the major food protein suppliers in the country here with us today.
Yes.
What role should the food industry play in ensuring that fewer children go hungry?
Well, I think the key here is in the nonprofit world, we do rely on both public and private resources to meet those needs. So that's very important. Protein, for example, is a critical item that is very difficult to get traditionally in the nonprofit world. So that is certainly an area that is important in supporting the nonprofit world. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the distribution of the food and the way we do it is also very important in addressing this issue as well. So again, I think the key is collaboration, whether we're working with a corporation, another nonprofit, the government, that type of thing. That is absolutely critical for us to be successful. And communication was mentioned earlier as well. Communication is also a very key factor in this area.
So we do have a question from the audience. And remember, you can enter your questions in the chat at the bottom of your screen. Question is to everyone. You talked about climate change as a major future issue. What changes to disaster recovery in the Farm Bill do you feel need to be addressed and changed?
Betsy, I'd be happy to jump in on that first, because that is a question and a challenge that we have dealt with in the beef industry for many years, because we have not found that program that truly has been able to help us address disasters as they pop up, whether that's wildfire, whether that's drought, whether it's hurricanes, et cetera. So I think that as an industry, we have spent some time saying, okay, we've seen a lot of the ad hoc disaster programs in the past. We've seen some of the pilot programs that have been out there. What do we need to change in order to get a program that is going to be much more beneficial to producers? And for years, we had kind of pushed back against the notion of having a crop insurance-like program for the cattle industry. But now we've realized that we probably need to set aside our previous positions and look at what opportunities might be available to set up a program like that, specifically for livestock. So that's going to be one of our priorities as we go into this next farm bill, to see what we can do from that standpoint of having more effective insurance programs for livestock production.
Yeah, Betsy, I just add on to that. Colin's exactly right. I mean, we've been very fortunate in the amount of assistance that's been provided, but it hadn't always been targeted exactly the right way. And certainly the livestock industry has really been kind of left out. That said, when you talk about the farm bill, one of the fundamental building blocks of that farm bill now remains crop insurance. And as lenders, we couldn't do our job without a strong, stable crop insurance program. And it's far from perfect and needs to be expanded and needs to be tailored to a lot of different industries' needs. But I just think that you just can't manage enough risk in agriculture today without crop insurance, and that needs to be a priority moving forward.
Any other comments on that question? Okay, we have another question in the chat, probably for Gary. Has refrigeration played a role in being able to get foods to those that need it? If so, how has this been addressed?
Yeah, it definitely plays a critical role in the nonprofit world to get food to those in need. One of the challenges we have, quite honestly, though, in the nonprofit world is capacity. A lot of the nonprofits we work with have some cold storage or refrigeration capabilities, and but most do not even have enough capacity for a truckload of refrigerated or frozen food products. So that is a challenge. The other part is refrigeration, moving product from the donor to a nonprofit is very expensive. So the cash side of that to support it is critical. And there are a limited number of nonprofits that have, you know, the cash to do that. Feed the Children does have some cold storage capabilities, and like we were talking about the protein before, and that's been critical. But it has played a major role. We've been able to move a lot of product in smaller quantities to organizations that can distribute it. So and it has been extremely important during this pandemic.
Hey, Betsy, another angle on refrigeration, which was eye-opening for all of us in the meat production segment, is when you look at the way that ethanol plants had to scale down or shut down during the early days of the pandemic. What we realized is one of those byproducts, carbon dioxide, was a big part of our refrigeration needs in a lot of these packing plants. So there was a time in there, probably mid-April and early May, where there was significant concern as to whether or not we would have enough refrigerant to be able to keep that product cool. And I know from my perspective, just personally, but also from NCBA's perspective in the cattle industry, that was one connection that we had never made before. So that was really eye-opening. And again, just trying to show how many tentacles are out there when it comes to our supply chains. And when any one of them goes down, that ripple effect is going to be tremendous.
Interesting. Okay, another question in the chat about innovation in food chain supply. What are your thoughts on the development of direct sale and short circuit supply chains that we saw happen in response to the COVID crisis? Anyone?
Betsy, we've been shocked at how quickly the shift got made. To give you an idea, I'm on the phone with our Farm Credit System Association down in Florida early during the pandemic, right? And you kept hearing the supply chain's broken. People are having to plow under vegetables, right? Because vegetables get ready and they got to go, and suddenly they didn't have any place to go. Within a matter of weeks, we were hearing stories about farmers quickly shifting gears and starting to make their product available locally, and literally traffic jams of people trying to get that product. And I think that was a message to all of us, and that there is an opportunity here. People like to make some connection with where their food comes from. They'll pay up for it, and they're anxious to get it. And so we view this direct to retail innovation as one of the on-ramps for new people to get into agriculture. The barrier to entry in traditional agriculture is pretty severe. I mean, if you're not in a family that owns land and all of that, this is a hard business to get into. So more and more we see young farmers getting in on that direct to retail side, where a little goes a long way. And so we've started supporting farmers markets. We've got a lot of lending to young kids producing things that get sold for really good prices in metropolitan areas straight off the farm. And that's been one of the bright sides of the pandemic, is the acknowledgement from really all across the country that this direct to retail, direct to consumer sales channel is very strong.
It's a tremendous opportunity for us in the beef business. And we have seen the way that it has grown throughout the year, not only from smaller operators, but also a lot of the bigger companies have said, hey, here's another great opportunity for us as well. And I believe that we're going to see more of that, whether it's through crowd cow type of websites or whether it's local. There's going to be some opportunities here that we didn't have a year ago. NCBA has been supportive of legislation that was introduced in Congress called the Direct Act, which would allow small state inspected plants to be able to sell through e-commerce sites direct to consumer and across state lines. Again, just trying to make sure that we have a regulatory framework that helps those activities move forward. Now, of course, it's also a delicate balancing act to some extent, because while we want to have those opportunities, we also have to make sure that we don't have any food safety issues on our hands. Because if there is an E. coli outbreak from a local farmer's market, that doesn't necessarily become a farmer's market issue, that becomes a beef industry issue. So while we definitely believe that this is an opportunity, it's already presented itself as an opportunity, we've got to make sure we're smart about it so that way we don't have any negative hits on our industry because of a food safety situation.
Betsy, I'm back. This is Kevin. I'm on the phone now. I'm sorry. I don't know what happened.
Oh, welcome back. We're glad to have you back with us.
Thank you.
One more question from the chat. The food chain.
That's from me. Betsy, that's from Paul Weller, from me.
Yes, Paul, thank you. As demand from the needy increases, who will be paying for their food? What will be the impact on producers' prices? Will government assume these food purchases? What's your opinions on that question?
Well, this is Kevin, and I can say a little bit about that. One of the things that we have in our company at Tyson Foods is we have a focus on hunger insecurity. And as I mentioned earlier, throughout the pandemic, we've donated many millions of pounds of protein. We didn't just do that during the pandemic, we do it regularly. It's not going to feed everyone just coming from one company, but we need all companies that produce food to continue to support their communities and those in need by making food donations. And there's going to have to be also assistance from government. There's no doubt there already is, but as we all know, it doesn't answer all of the questions.
Anyone else want to chime in on that one? No. Okay. One more general question, and you may have touched on this before, but from each of your positions, what do you see as the greatest threat to domestic food security?
I'll start on this one because I've been given this a lot of thought, because there are so many threats that we're facing in agriculture every day. But I think the biggest one that we all are going to have to work collectively to try to overcome is just the misunderstanding of how food gets from the farm to the fork, from the gate to the plate. Because when you don't have that understanding, it leads to ballot initiatives that restrict what we can do. It leads to legislation that restricts what we can do. It leads to new rules and regs that just make it harder and harder for all of us in agriculture to do what we need to do to put that food on the table. So I believe the educational component of what we do is just key, especially as we just continue to see the number of farmers and ranchers decline, and more people just believing that milk comes from the store, the hamburger comes from McDonald's. That lends itself to really bad political decisions that then just have a direct impact on our ability to try to be profitable. And when you talk about sustainability, you can't be sustainable if you can't be profitable.
This is Kevin. I want to add to that. We believe farmers unquestionably are the backbone of our country, and the agricultural industry, we're always under attack, always. People think that we are the primary cause various issues, whether it's climate change or water pollution, we get attacked. There is not enough education and understanding on the fact that there are so many farmers doing a great job environmentally. There are so many farmers learning how to become more resilient, more profitable. And while there are many that continue to face losses of farms, bankruptcies, we all realize that's there, but you know, to the point of education, that's a slower process, but we need more of it. But we also need more incentives to help farmers to continue to grow their bottom lines and to become better and be able to contribute more. And there's a lot of work being done right now. You know, we've talked about climate change on this call today quite a bit, but there needs to be a lot more attention paid to the ability of farmers to pull carbon into the soil, to actually sequester carbon into the soil. We know it works, we know it's real, but there's a constant tension point between different scientific communities arguing about things such as soil science. There's a professor at The Ohio State University, Ratan Lal, Dr. Lal, who's done brilliant work in soil science, he and many others. But there needs to be a lot more attention paid to what can we do to help this process to get ag back on the map of being the solution to climate change and not to be demonized all the time.
Todd, did you have any comments on that one? No? Okay. All right. We're getting near the end of our hour. Oh, there's one more question here. Grangers across the nation are involved with agriculture in the classroom, K to 12 students. How can Grangers work with the 3-panel groups to provide more information to the rural and urban student? It's a little different focus question there.
You know, I think that's a great question, Betsy. That's always been a priority. You know, I would encourage you to do this. There's not much I can do from Washington, D.C. to help on that. But what I'll tell you is reach out to your local Farm Credit System institution. They've got a range of experts on virtually every commodity grown in the local area and can bring a real different perspective to that. And they got people that would love the chance to do it. And so I would encourage you to reach out to your local Farm Credit institution and try to partner with them. I think they can be a resource for you.
Great, thank you. Kevin, do you have a remark on that? I saw you.
I don't really have anything to add to that other than I do like the idea of continuing the dialogue and reaching out. I mean, reach out in your communities more. I mean, that may sound rather simple, but there just is not a good level of understanding on what farmers really do and the greatness they bring to our world. And, you know, some of the comments made about milk coming from a grocery store and, you know, your meat coming from a fast food restaurant. Well, it's true, but people need to understand the truth about where things really come from, how hard these families work to make things happen, and the great work they do to take care of the land. Incredible work going on, taking care of the land. And other people get a hold of the narrative, and unfortunately, we then end up with articles that are not supportive of agriculture.
Yes, thank you. Okay, I think we're about out of time. Do the panelists have any closing remarks, anything that we did not touch on that you want to mention?
Thanks for doing this.
Agreed. Thanks for having me.
Yep. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. This has been a great opportunity. I apologize that we are having internet problems today in Arkansas, but I did get back on. But yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. We've seen today that by increasing the use of precision agriculture, the U.S. can improve food security and meet growing demand for food, reduce the environmental impact of agricultural practices, reduce food waste, improve the profitability of U.S. agriculture, increase skilled labor demand to support the farm, but not necessarily on the farm, to deliver food where it needs to go, to fight domestic hunger, and to increase U.S. competitiveness internationally, among other things. Of course, I need to add here, it was mentioned briefly, that you can't have precision agriculture in the field without rural broadband. We all need to advocate for deployment of broadband service to the last mile and to the last acre. So thank you very much to our panelists. It was great information. Thanks for sharing your great insights. And thank you to the audience for joining our webinar today.